He was a real estate tycoon with expensive tastes.
He wanted people to know that he had money, that he was successful.
He's the kind of person that when he came in the room, you knew he had come in the room.
Until his mile-high ambitions came crashing down to earth.
For someone to be literally blown up in a high-profile, high-end Tucson resort was very attention-grabbing.
The investigation would delve into the exclusive world of Tucson's rich and famous to catch an assassin out to make a killing.
The story is the epitome of American greed.
Friday, November 1st, 1996. It's a little after 5 p.m., and Tucson's leisure class is kicking off the weekend with a round of golf. The players are among the city's most rich and powerful, and the biggest name on the course is 52-year-old Gary Triano.
Gary Triano was a very charismatic personality. He was sort of a larger-than-life real estate mogul.
Every Friday, he would be out on the course with people he was trying to get to invest in his latest venture.
But this time, Gary's wheeling and dealing ends with a bang.
And at the end of the golfing, he came back to his car, and when he got into his car, the bomb went off.
The explosion is described as like a funnel cloud that can be seen for miles from this resort.
The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield's gone.
It looked like somebody had just crushed this Lincoln Continental like a matchbox.
First responders quickly arrive, but 52-year-old father and businessman Gary Triano is pronounced dead at the scene.
There was no chance that Gary was going to survive this explosion. He was right on top of it.
How could somebody hate somebody so much to want to murder them in such a violent and public way?
Gary Triano was a longtime resident of Tucson who'd grown up with dreams of making it big.
He was a Tucson kid, went to the University of Arizona, was in business with his father, if I remember right, selling cars in the beginning.
Gary was first married to Mary Cram, and they were a very, very powerful couple, I would say. They had 2 children.
By the early 80s, Gary had closed enough deals to become Tucson's leading real estate developer.
If you were someone who was involved in the financial business in Tucson, Gary Triano was somebody you would have known.
Gary was very flamboyant. He was a high roller. When he had money, he would spend money. He would tip lavishly. He would go on long trips to Europe.
But Gary also took care of those less fortunate.
Gary was very philanthropic, and he believed in the Boys and Girls Club here. He was very, very good to this community.
In 1986, Gary's reputation earned him the attention of another Tucson luminary, Pamela Phillips.
But Pam was, kind of up by the bootstraps gal from Tucson.
She wanted to be one of the first females that was in commercial real estate in Tucson. And she achieved that. She made it all the way to the top.
Gary hosted numerous parties, and friends tell me that she would go to these parties, and that's how they met.
She sort of crashed the party, zeroed in on Gary. They had a whirlwind romance. They get married right away. They have a very lavish wedding. It's a black tie affair on a yacht in San Diego.
He left Mary to get married to Pamela Phillips.
They were kind of a power couple, in Tucson. Donald Trump came here at one point with Marlo Maples and stayed with them for about a month.
They became friends and later went down to Mar-a-Lago.
They become part of that jet set where they're flying off to, have lunch in Greece or flying to his estate in Florida.
But in the early 90s, Gary and Pam's jet-setting days came to a sudden end.
He was, tapped out. I mean, all those wonderful jet trips cost a lot of money.
She realizes that her marriage is not what she believed it to be when she's pregnant with her first child. But 2 kids into the marriage, she's now having to put up her own money to keep Gary afloat.
Gary was forced out of one of the Indian gaming businesses at the time, and once he was forced out of that, as well as some of the real estate things that were going on, Gary lost money and ended up having to file for bankruptcy.
Gary started getting into real trouble financially, and I think Pam got very scared for her and her children's safety because of that. And I think that's what finally triggered the divorce.
I mean, they were not happy with each other. So she takes the kids and takes off to Aspen. He's gone through a bankruptcy. He is living in a spare bedroom of a friend of his. He's driving a borrowed car. He's more down and out than he's been for quite a while.
In spite of these setbacks, Gary was determined to turn his life around.
Gary was the type of guy that he would never give up, and even though he was down today, there was a real good chance that by next year he'd be back on top.
He wanted to convey the image and the message that he was making some kind of a comeback.
But he would never get the chance. Someone had made sure Gary never climbed back to the top, and Tucson police are determined to find out who.
Everybody was in total disbelief. This is the kind of stuff that you read about, you see it on TV, but you don't think it's going to happen to you.
This is not only a whodunit case and a howdunit case. What would drive somebody to do this?
Coming up, Gary Triano was deeper in the hole than anyone realized.
When reporters asked the sheriff if there are any suspects, Sheriff Dupnik said, "Open the phone book."
Millionaire real estate developer Gary Triano has been killed by a car bomb outside of Tucson's exclusive La Paloma Country Club. Police arrive to find the area in complete chaos.
It's really hectic because you've got bits and pieces of the car all over the parking lot. You've got golfers and employees wandering out now into the crime scene. It's pandemonium.
Initially, what we do is we totally contain the scene. So in other words, we shut down the entire country club. What you see initially when you actually go to the blast scene is there's a Lincoln Town car sitting parked in a parking space. The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield was blown out of the car over the trees and landed in the swimming pool.
There were parts of the car up on the roofs of the buildings nearby.
To see a major, massively destructive blast like this was a first for me. I mean, this would be the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle, with no picture of what the puzzle was.
The crime scene is so complex, federal agents are brought in to assist the investigation. Over the next few days, they are able to reconstruct the bombing.
It's not just the sheriff's department at that point, but they call in assistance from the Tucson Police Department bomb squad. ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The FBI comes in.
The ATF guys, they took all the pieces of the material back to their lab in California, and they started telling us about how it was a pipe bomb.
The bomb looked like it had been sort of like it was an amateur had done it. You know, it was a 17-inch pipe bomb, which was already a strange measurement for a pipe bomb.
The device was actually overbuilt for its purpose. It was far more explosive power than was needed. Our belief was it was built off the instructions off the internet and probably wasn't built to the specifics of killing a sole occupant of a vehicle.
The bomb itself, we were able to determine, was housed in a canvas bag, a mundane canvas bag, easily purchased. Through interviews, we knew that Gary very rarely locked his car, so it was not hard to believe that the killer just opened the car door, placed the bag with the bomb in it.
What we didn't know is what detonated the device. Was it motion activated? Was it on a timer? Or was it command detonated?
Eventually, what ATF is able to determine is that it was remote controlled. The killer was probably within 100 yards, laying in wait with his remote detonator.
And that told us that the killer had to be in the parking lot. They had to watch Gary get into the car that night before they detonated the bomb.
And the bombers set their trap for Gary during his birthday weekend.
It was his birthday, and there was a celebration for him that weekend. So he may very well have thought that this was somebody, a friend, that dropped off a birthday present for him.
The golf outing had been prearranged so that the family knew where he was going to be and when he would be coming back home.
They were waiting, all excited to surprise him, and instead, their surprise turned into a nightmare. Had to have been somebody who knew Gary, knew his habits.
He had to sit there patiently waiting after he planted the device in the car. And then once he saw Mr. Triano get in the car, he pulls the trigger.
It's pretty evil when you think about it.
When investigators speak to Gary's family, they say he's made more than a few enemies over the years.
What we found out pretty soon was that Gary had a lot of business dealings, but he currently was in a large amount of debt, over $26 million in debt.
It was clear by the end of his life that he was spending a lot of money he didn't have.
Gary had lots of friends in high places, and he was able to sort of, rob Peter to pay Paul. He was always doing a sort of shell game where he was shuffling money around.
Gary's ex-wife believes one of those enemies decided to get payback.
When Pam and I met at the sheriff's department, she talked a lot about the Indian gaming and about threats as a result of the Indian gaming.
She believes that Gary, was involved in all kinds of nefarious dealings and that it had to have been organized crime somehow.
She said he was on a hit list, and she was scared. And I never saw her scared.
We talked to numerous people who told us that Gary had mentioned to them that he felt like he was being followed. We never were able to get anything that we felt like we could follow up on as far as identifying who that might be.
If you owe money to the mob, they kill you publicly so other people get the message.
Coming up, a shocking tip leads investigators across state lines.
When you take all the information that was found, you can't ignore it. It's almost like this guy has got his shopping list to murder Gary Triano.
Tucson police are investigating the murder of 52-year-old real estate mogul Gary Triano, and the evidence so far suggests his killer might be connected to the mafia.
Tucson is the place that a lot of reputed mobsters have retired in because they consider it safe. It's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. The Bonanno family retired there. The Castellanos retired there.
The idea that it was a mob hit, it came from the fact that it was a car bombing.
When you think of a car bomb, you think of sort of East Coast mafia, mob kind of thing.
With over $25 million in unpaid debts, the list of suspects seems endless.
Gary had borrowed money from a lot of different people. There were investors in Mexico that some people thought were, less than reputable. he had actually started negotiations with a group in China.
Gary Triano not only owed $4.5 million to casinos in Las Vegas, he was threatening a lawsuit against a guy named Gary Fears in St. Louis.
Gary had so many enemies that, it would have been easier to find out who wanted to keep him alive than want him dead.
Detectives track down every possible lead, but despite his suspicious business dealings, they keep coming up empty-handed.
In the days and weeks after the bombing, detectives are interviewing every known associate of Gary Triano that they can find.
You follow out the thread of organized crime. You follow out the thread of a person who was financially crippled by Mr. Triano's failed financial advice. And as you followed each of those out through the investigation, they all just went away. There was nothing in his life that when you took it and amassed it and put it together that led to a motive for murder.
Then, just as the investigation seems to hit a dead end, the Pima County Sheriff's Office receives some unexpected help.
It was national news, and that first week after the bombing, I got a message to call a detective in Aspen, Colorado. And that's when I first met Detective Jim Crowley. Detective Crowley talked to me about a fraud investigation that he was involved in, that Ron Young was the principal suspect.
He was a businessman who was really more of a confidence man.
Investigators learn that 7 months before Gary Triano's murder, Aspen authorities were preparing to bring in Ron Young on fraud charges. He disappeared before they got the chance.
He was on the run. He was on the run because he had a warrant out for his arrest.
Ron Young had rented a van using a fictitious credit card. And result of that, the van was reported stolen.
The van stolen in Aspen had turned up in California 1 month before the murder, and it appears to contain new evidence investigators now realize is connected to Gary's murder.
In October of 1996, in Brea, California, some neighbors report a van that's been parked on their street in a cul-de-sac for a few days. They call the local law enforcement. The cop sees it as a stolen vehicle, and they call the detective up in Aspen that had taken the stolen report and say, we got this van, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it that we have no idea what this means.
Jim Crowley, the detective from Aspen, searches the van, and in it he finds a sawed-off shotgun. He finds notes that list close relations or friends of Gary Triano. He finds a map of Tucson.
Detective Crowley says, hey, I saw the bombing on the news, and I think that bombing is related to a fraud case that I've been working in Aspen.
He knew that he had to get a hold of us and share his information with our investigation.
When Tucson detectives inspect the van's contents, they find more clues connecting Ron to the bombing.
We went back to all the contents of the van and really delved into them. And that's when we found friends and relatives, car descriptions, car license plates of friends and family close to Gary Triano.
They've got receipts from a hotel here in Tucson that was in close proximity of where the Triano house was.
We went to the hotel and went through all their receipts from 1996, and were able to show that Ron had stayed in this hotel here in Tucson for about a week prior to the murder.
It's quite possible when Gary told his friend that he felt somebody was following him, it was Ronald Young.
But why would a con man from Aspen murder a struggling Tucson real estate developer?
It's all very suspicious, but where's the motive? At this point, Ron Young has just disappeared. He is nowhere to be found. He has gone off the maps.
Coming up, investigators follow the money to find the missing pieces of the puzzle.
In other words, who benefited financially from Gary's death?
Thanks to a call from the Aspen Police Department, investigators in Tucson have discovered that a con man named Ronald Young was targeting Gary Triano. The question is, why? As detectives in Arizona and Colorado compare notes, they realize the two men share a personal connection.
Jim Crowley, a detective with the Aspen Police Department, he said, I happen to have interest in Pam Phillips, who is Gary Triano's ex-wife.
Before the bombing happens, Detective Crawley gets an interesting phone call from Pam Phillips about a year prior. Pam Phillips calls him up because Pam has realized that she's just been defrauded, bilked out of $300,000 by Ron.
She called me and said, yeah, I just got taken and this guy just, took all my money.
But it seems Pam had quickly withdrawn the accusation.
Crowley goes into depth that publicly she cried wolf, that Ron Young had done these horrible financial things to me, but wouldn't go on record and wouldn't file a report with the Aspen Police Department.
Meanwhile, Ron and her kind of make up, and she strangely calls Detective Cowley and says, you know what? It was my mistake. I made an accounting error, and I don't want to press charges anymore.
I'd ask her about him, and she'd just turn her head and walk away. She never, ever said his name again.
Pam's friends think they know why. According to them, the two had started out as business partners about a year after her divorce, but their relationship wasn't strictly professional.
Initially, their relationship is sort of a teacher-pupil relationship. Ron is making himself useful in Pam's life. He's taking care of her business, and their relationship sort of morphs into more than a business arrangement.
And it came out that she was romantically involved with Ronald Young in Aspen.
Every once in a while, they'll have drinks too late, and Ron will wind up asleep on the couch, sometimes then wanders into the bedroom.
I think Pam used her beauty and sex for men in that way. That was her tool.
Investigators now know that Pam is the connection between Ron and Gary Triano. But had Ron been using her to get to her husband? Or was Pam in on the plot?
It could be, certainly, that Ron Young had sort of looked into Pam Phillips's background, collected a lot of information about her and her ex-husband to try to perpetrate some further fraud on her.
The big question that remained for Detective Gamber was, did he work alone? Did Ron Young do this on his own?
To test Pam, investigators ask her to come in for an interview.
During the interview, I didn't want her to know how much I knew about Ron. So when I pretty much nonchalantly threw his name out, there was just a long pause.
She's denying his relationship with her. She completely minimizes him and their relationship to the point of, how did you hear about him?
Outwardly, she appeared to cooperate with the investigation. It wasn't until we asked her if she would take a polygraph that she started some more pausing and some more, no, I don't know if I want to do that.
Police find Pam's behavior suspicious. But she and Gary were already divorced. So what motive would she have for killing him?
We have to follow the money. And where it got interesting is when we started to look at Pam Phillips.
We had pulled the divorce records, and we knew that there were a lot of issues. The divorce wasn't smooth. There was fight over the children. There was allegations that Gary was hiding money.
This is a time when Pam is running out of money. I mean, she tells the au pair at one point that she's down to her last $60,000.
As investigators dig deeper, they discover that Pam still stood to gain a lot from Gary's death.
The detectives are doing their due diligence. They do find out about the insurance policy that Pam Phillips had on Gary's life, that she maintained even after the divorce.
The insurance policy consisted of a $2 million life insurance. I was told, and then we were able to confirm through records, that the children were the beneficiaries.
But the children are minors, and so Pam's the guardian, of course, so she's getting the money.
Pam took that money and bought her first house with it in Aspen. I was invited over there to go house hunting with her.
It's like who had the most to benefit and who had the motive. And Pam Phillips had the motive.
But investigators know it's still not enough to make an arrest.
So the really frustrating part about this case is that, they have all of this evidence, but there's too many loose ends.
Pam Phillips was definitely a potential suspect. However, one of the main people that we wanted to talk to was a fugitive, and he was nowhere to be found.
By November of 1997, the case has come to a complete standstill. Detectives begin to wonder if it will ever be solved.
We revisit the story on the 1-year anniversary. Still no arrests, no one in custody, no person of interest, nothing, nada.
The only really unknown at the end of the task force was we needed to talk to Ron Young.
Coming up, the hunt for the missing con man finally ends.
So after this long 9-year hiatus, they finally get the tip.
Nearly a decade after the murder of Gary Triano, detectives are still focused on 2 suspects, Pamela Phillips and Ron Young. But they still don't have enough evidence to charge either of them, and Ron is still in hiding.
Everybody worked this case down to the last possible lead, and then we were left, where's Ron Young?
In November of 2005, investigators decide to make one last attempt to draw Ron out.
I mean, there's this push that we need to do something on it. The sheriff's department really wants to solve this case.
When the thought of America's Most Wanted came up, it seemed like a logical way to at least try to locate him.
It really hit the national spotlight when it debuted. It just kind of let everybody know to be on the lookout for this man who is a person of interest, Ronald Young.
The episode airs on November 19th. Within 24 hours, Tucson police get the tip they were hoping for.
What happened was Ron Young's chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called in and said, Ron, this guy is a patient of mine, but he's a patient under a different name.
Not only is he a client, but he's got an appointment that morning. So there is this scramble for the fugitive detail in Broward County to set up outside this chiropractor's office. Sure enough, Ron Young comes up in a taxi and is immediately apprehended.
With Ron finally in custody, investigators swiftly execute a search warrant for his apartment and vehicle.
There are boxes and boxes of, all sorts of things, floppy disks, thumb drives, hard drives, paper receipts. There is just this treasure trove of information.
As the recordings were analyzed, as computer was analyzed, it was evident that they had a financial relationship.
The evidence that's becoming clear is that Ron Young is owed $400,000 by Pam Phillips for a job that he did for her.
He's meticulously, like an accountant, kept track of every payment.
Over the course of years, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash that Pam Phillips is sending to Ron Young. That's obviously huge evidence, but it's the phone calls that Ron Young has been recording between the two of them that ultimately is the downfall for both of them.
When investigators listen to the tapes, they immediately recognize the 2 voices.
We took one of the micro cassettes, put it into a recorder, and started to play it, and instantly you heard Ron Young's voice, and he was talking to Pam Phillips.
I can't really talk right now, but I put something in the mail. Thanks, bye.
And the minute I heard her voice, I knew that he was talking on the phone with Pam Phillips. And at that point, I just said, this has got to be the answer. Probably one of the most damning recordings was when there was an argument over the money, how much she was sending or how much she wasn't sending.
I'm like cashless. I need to restructure, reorganize, do something. You know what? I just can't handle this. I really can't. It's too dangerous.
She argues with him, says, I've paid you enough. And Ron Young says, you will pay me the rest of my money or you will be in prison for murder. And her response is, so will you.
That's when I said, okay, we've got him.
But when Aspen police try to arrest Pamela, they discover she's now on the run.
After the indictment came down, they found that she had left for Europe.
What we know is that she took a flight that took her through Atlanta, then on to Gatwick Airport in London, and then possibly on to Munich. And that's all we know.
To track her down, detectives enlist the aid of Interpol.
They start conducting a European investigation on her. And about 1 year later, I get a call, and it's basically Pam is in custody in Vienna, Austria.
The way that they track her down, in a very ironic, almost coincidental scenario, is she stiffs her limousine driver.
She didn't pay him one time, and the guy went to the police there. That's how she got caught.
She has again found herself a rich man, to align with. And she's living the high life again. She has literally reinvented herself in Vienna, Austria.
On July 2nd, 2010, Pam is finally taken into custody at the Tucson International Airport.
What was reported to me is her comment was, if Gamber's in the airport, I'm not getting off the plane. Then she gets handed over to me. So it was a good feeling.
I kept asking her questions the whole time until she got into the detective's car. And I said, well, how does it feel to be back in Tucson? And she looked at me and she said, it's very hot. Well, it got a lot hotter.
Coming up, Gary's accused killers finally stand trial. But will a jury convict them?
I knew it was only the beginning. The investigation was going to go under a microscope.
Nearly 18 years after the murder of real estate tycoon Gary Triano, prosecutors in Tucson, Arizona have finally charged two co-conspirators with the crime. Gary's ex-wife, Pamela Phillips, and her ex-lover, Ron Young. The trials began with Ron Young in February of 2010.
The evidence is, the recordings, all the evidence that he'd saved.
He makes a trip to Tucson, and he stalks Gary, and he learns about his habits.
Ron Young had established Gary's pattern of going to the La Paloma Country Club. He constructed the device. He planted it in the car. He sat back and he waited for Gary Triano's golf game to end, and that's when he hit the detonate button.
The public defender's office just said that the state's case was very circumstantial and didn't rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt.
But the jury disagrees. Ron is found guilty.
Ron never admitted to anything. He professed his innocence throughout the trial. It was the jury that came back and decided that he was involved in this.
4 years later, it's Pamela's turn to face a jury.
Before she goes to trial, the judge deemed that she was incompetent to stand trial. So she goes through all these tests and she goes through all this rehabilitation to get her competent to stand trial.
Basically, the prosecution theory of the case is that Ron Young was hired by Pam Phillips to kill Gary Triano.
They wind up getting into an arrangement where Pam convinces Ron that she's got this $2 million life insurance policy and that if he carries out this hit on Gary, she'll pay him $400,000.
According to the DA, the meticulous notes Ron kept are more than enough proof of Pam's involvement.
She gets the money from the insurance claim early 1997, and she starts paying Ron Young these payments shortly thereafter. We're talking $400,000, and it's being paid out in bits and pieces. You know, it was very suspicious.
He was doing work for her, trying to help her start this business called Star Babies, and he wanted the money sent to him in a wire transactions that were kind of separated and hidden and looked bad.
But that isn't the only evidence linking Pamela to the murder. On February 27th, prosecutors call a new witness to the stand.
Pam has a best friend of hers, Laura Chapman, who is the prosecution's surprise witness.
After Ron Young's trial and he's convicted, Laura Chapman comes forward.
She says, you know, Pam told me before Gary was murdered that when they were having marital problems, that Pam should just hire a hitman and take him out. That became sort of the smoking gun of Pam Phillips' trial.
However, the defense argues that none of it proves Pam is guilty of murder.
They could never really place her at the scene of the crime, you know, so they have to link her to Ron, and they have to link her through emails and things that can be interpreted differently.
In fact, Pam's attorneys have their own theory about who killed Gary.
The whole defense was geared toward this dead billionaire in Tucson that had a beef with Gary Triano.
The person we think was involved with this case was a guy named Neil McNeese. Neil McNeese had been threatening to kill Gary Triano for a number of years. We all know as trial lawyers that if you do a third-party culpability, it's your story versus the state's theory of the case. It's not about reasonable doubt anymore. It's about whose theory the jury believes.
As the jury deliberates, it's anyone's guess which story they will believe.
You're always nervous about whether or not you were able to come up with enough evidence that the jury would agree with your theory of the case.
On April 8th, 2014, they return with their verdict.
She's guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and first-degree murder. And her sentence is natural life in prison, which in Arizona means that's life without parole.
It wasn't until we got the verdict that I breathed a sigh of relief. That was probably the most gratification that most homicide detectives get on a case.
Gary's children were there, his ex-wife was there, his brother, and there was just this sense of relief. I mean, after almost 2 decades, they finally felt that they got some measure of justice.
An insatiable desire for the finer things in life had driven Pam to gamble on the perfect murder. Instead, she'd lost everything.
There was, I think, some sadness that here Pam Phillips, she didn't have to do this. She was not destitute by any means.
Pam orchestrated this murder absolutely out of revenge, but also just plain and simple greed. She was told that she was going to live a lavish lifestyle, be part of the rich and famous, be this elite socialite. It just sort of epitomized the ugly side of American greed. You know, what would somebody do for money